In the autumn of 1852, the air over Beaufort County, South Carolina, was heavy, not just with the scent of rice fields and river mist, but with whispers. Whispers about a name that once commanded respect, now spoken only in uneasy tones. Harrington. Raven's Cross Plantation had stood for nearly half a century, a sprawling estate of white columns, dark secrets, and wealth built on the backs of the enslaved. But on November 13, 1852, something happened that no one in Charleston society could quite understand. Elias Harrington, the 31-year-old master of Raven's Cross, marched into the county magistrate's office and filed marriage papers. But where the bride's name should have been written, the space was left blank. Imagine the scene: a respected planter, impeccably dressed, his signature steady, his eyes cold. He hands over the document and walks out. Witnesses sign their names, attesting to a marriage that, on paper, doesn't exist. What kind of man files a wedding certificate without a bride? And what kind of woman remains nameless even in the eyes of the law? 2 days later, a small column appeared in the Charleston Mercury. A wedding of unusual circumstance has taken place at Raven's Cross. No further explanation. No photographs, no announcements. Just silence. That silence would grow, spreading across the county like a fog. Servants, merchants, and even neighboring plantation owners avoided the topic entirely. Some claimed it was scandalous, others believed it was supernatural. But the truth, as it would later emerge, was darker than either. At the time, Elias Harrington was already a man teetering on the edge. He'd inherited Raven's Cross after his father's death, along with its wealth and its cruelty. He was known for two things: his ruthless business sense and his addiction to gambling. Cards, horses, dice, it didn't matter. Harrington played for keeps. And lately, he'd been losing. Debt records from the Beaufort archives show he owed a fortune to a merchant banker named Isaac Thornton, a man whose reputation for collecting debts was as cold as the marble floors of his Philadelphia offices. Over the months leading up to that November, their letters grew increasingly tense, Harrington begging for more time, Thornton demanding satisfaction. But on October 28th, a final letter arrived, written in Thornton's sharp, deliberate hand. The matter is resolved as discussed. You shall have your satisfaction, though not in the manner originally intended. Those words would become a ghost in ink, a prelude to something twisted, something arranged. When Thornton's carriage rolled up to Raven's Cross in early November, the household staff noticed the difference immediately. Their master, usually composed, was pale, agitated, pacing the veranda, muttering under his breath. The banker stayed only one night, but when he left, he wore a smile that servants would later describe as too pleased for business. Harrington, meanwhile, locked himself in his study for 2 days.
He didn't eat. He didn't speak.
And when he finally emerged, his first command was simple but strange. Prepare the chapel. There will be a ceremony. The overseer's log from that day survives, a chilling entry written in clean, efficient script. The woman M is to be bathed, dressed, and brought to the main house by sundown. No name, just an initial. But among the enslaved, everyone knew who M was. Martha, a housemaid, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and often overlooked. Her work was quiet, invisible. She wasn't known for beauty or wit, only for her loyalty. Yet on that night, she was dressed in borrowed lace, her hair pulled back, her hands trembling as she stood before the man who owned her and became his wife. No music played. No guests were invited. Just the sound of rain tapping on the chapel roof, and 2 witnesses who would later refuse to speak of what they saw. The next morning, everything changed. Martha was moved from the kitchen to a small room adjoining the main house, a space once used for sewing. And Elias Harrington issued a new rule to his staff. She will be addressed as Madam. One young servant laughed when he heard it, a nervous, confused laugh. By the next day, he was gone, sold to another plantation. No one laughed again. From that moment on, Raven's Cross fell under a heavy, unnatural quiet. Visitors stopped coming. The once bustling house seemed to shrink into itself. Harrington withdrew, and Martha, The woman no one had ever noticed now walked the halls in silence, her eyes lowered, her presence like a shadow that could no longer be ignored. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one yet knew that what had begun as a desperate gamble would soon become one of the most chilling reckonings in plantation history, a story that would twist the very idea of power, love, and revenge until no one could tell where victim ended and master began. Because at Raven's Cross, silence was never just silence. It was the beginning of something waiting and watching. Long before the mysterious wedding, Elias Harrington was already gambling away more than his fortune. He was gambling with fate itself. To outsiders, he was the picture of Southern refinement, sharp suits, inherited wealth, and that effortless charm that made Charleston's social circles forgive his arrogance. But behind closed doors, Elias had a sickness, one that came not from his bloodline, but from his own restless pride. He couldn't stop betting. Cards, horse races, riverboat games, anything with odds. He believed he could outthink chance, outsmart luck itself. But by the fall of 1852, luck had turned its back on him. His debts stacked higher than his ledgers could conceal. Raven's Cross was drowning in unpaid notes. And the man holding those notes was Isaac Thornton. Thornton wasn't a man accustomed to mercy. A merchant banker from Philadelphia, he'd built his fortune not just through trade, but through leverage, knowing exactly how far to push a debtor before they broke. He had the patience of a spider and the heart of one too. Letters between him and Elias, later found in Charleston archives, revealed a slow tightening of that web, each letter colder than the last. Your next payment is past due. Extensions cannot continue indefinitely. I will accept alternate terms if proposed promptly. By October, Elias was desperate enough to consider anything. Thornton, however, already had a plan, one far crueler than repossession or ruin. On the evening of November 10th, Thornton's carriage rolled up the drive of Raven's Cross. The rain had turned the road to mud, but the banker's polished boots stayed spotless. Servants whispered that he brought documents, and something else. The meeting between the two men lasted late into the night. No one heard the full conversation, but according to a letter found years later in Thornton's own papers, one line stood out. You shall have your satisfaction, though not in the manner originally intended. What satisfaction meant remained unclear. But by the next morning, Thornton left the plantation whistling, an unsettling sound from a man who rarely smiled. Inside, Elias locked himself away. For 2 full days, he didn't emerge. The curtains stayed drawn, the house eerily silent. He refused meals, ignored knocks, and when he finally opened the door, his face had changed. The fire that once lived in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something else. Fear? Resignation? Perhaps both. His first words to the overseer were clipped hollow. Prepare the chapel. Years later, researchers would piece together fragments of what happened that night, fragments that told of an agreement too cruel to be coincidence. Thornton, the banker, had connections in Charleston's trade network, connections that included the buying and selling of enslaved people. Among the names that appeared on his ledger was one, Martha, a woman transferred from a Philadelphia household back to South Carolina just weeks before the supposed wedding. Was this the arrangement they discussed? Did Thornton, knowing Elias's pride and desperation, force him to marry one of his own enslaved women as repayment for his debt? Or had Martha herself been part of something far more deliberate, a plan that began long before either man realized it? The historical records don't agree. But one detail does, that the entire affair began not from love, nor madness, but from a deal, a cruel transaction between two men blinded by arrogance. But why Martha? Among the enslaved at Raven's Cross, she wasn't remarkable. She worked quietly in the kitchen, large-framed and steady-handed. She'd been on the plantation for years, long enough to blend into the background. Too heavy for the fields, too quiet for gossip, she was nearly invisible. And that invisibility, as history would later reveal, became her greatest weapon. According to accounts collected decades later by historian Harriet Jacobs, Martha was summoned to the main house without explanation. She was bathed, dressed in lace, and told to stand before her master. There, under the flicker of candlelight, she watched him place a ring on her finger, his expression stiff, his jaw clenched. No one recorded what she said. Maybe she said nothing at all. Maybe silence was her only resistance. But from that night forward, nothing at Raven's Cross felt the same. In the weeks that followed, Elias became a ghost of himself. He stopped writing, stopped entertaining, stopped gambling altogether. The house grew still, unnaturally so. He ate in silence. He drank alone. And Martha, the woman who had once scrubbed his floors, now dined across from him each evening in the great hall, silent, composed, watching. The staff whispered that their master was cursed, that he'd made a bargain no sane man would make. And perhaps they were right, because from that night on, it wasn't clear who truly owned Raven's Cross, Elias, or the woman he'd been forced to call wife. It was a night that should never have existed, a marriage without love, without choice, and, for a time, without even a name. The chapel at Raven's Cross sat near the edge of the plantation grounds, where the live oaks leaned over like mourners. On November 12th, 1852, its pews stood empty, its candles flickered weakly in the humid air, and the only sounds were the low rustle of the swamp wind and the uneven rhythm of two breathing hearts, one broken, one terrified. Inside that small chapel, Elias Harrington stood at the altar in his tailored coat and trembling hands. Across from him, Martha, the enslaved woman no one had ever imagined would stand in such a place, stared at the floor, her fingers clutching the hem of a borrowed dress. It wasn't white, it wasn't even new. It was a cast-off from a cousin's wedding, yellowed with age, patched where lace had frayed. Witnesses said Elias spoke the vows through clenched teeth. He looked neither at Martha nor at the preacher, as though reciting words under invisible duress. When the minister asked if he took this woman as his lawful wife, Elias hesitated long enough for one of the servants to whisper a prayer under her breath. Then, quietly, he said, "I do." Martha's response was barely audible, a whisper, lost in the creaking of the chapel floor. And just like that, it was done. No music, no cheers, just a silence so deep that even the night insects outside seemed to have stopped singing. The next morning, the plantation woke to new orders. The overseer posted them on the kitchen wall. Martha is to be addressed as Madam Harrington. Failure to comply will result in punishment. For the first time, the enslaved people of Raven's Cross had a mistress who'd once labored beside them, and a master who couldn't look her in the eye. That day, Martha was moved from the servants' quarters to a small room adjoining the main house, a space that still smelled faintly of fabric and lavender, the remnants of its former life as a sewing room. A single bed, a washstand, and a locked door. No one knew what was said between Elias and Martha in those early days. But the house began to change, subtly, unnervingly. The dinners that had once been loud with guests grew eerily quiet. The silverware clinked against fine china, but conversation had vanished. Elias's voice, once commanding, now wavered when he spoke to her. Martha never raised hers above a whisper. And yet, somehow, she filled every room she entered. By the end of that first week, servants noticed something strange. Elias had stopped sleeping in his bedchamber. The light in his study burned all night. From the hallway, some claimed they could hear him pacing, muttering to himself, and once, laughing, a short, cracked laugh that made even the bravest avoid his door. Downstairs, Martha began to move with a quiet confidence that unsettled the household. She ate at the main table. She dressed in garments sent from Charleston, dresses ordered under Elias's name, but fitted to her figure. To those who had once ordered her around, it was disorienting. One day she had been invisible. The next, she was the center of everything. Yet behind her calm exterior, fear lingered. One kitchen maid later told a writer that Martha's hands still shook when she lifted a teacup, that she flinched when anyone spoke too loudly, that she spent hours alone, staring out of the parlor window toward the chapel, the same place where she'd been forced to say, "I do." But something else began to grow beneath that fear, a stillness. A composure that, over time, replaced her trembling. Martha's silence wasn't emptiness. It was calculation. Witnesses described her eyes as steady, unnerving, too knowing. It was as though she were studying the man who had once owned her, measuring him, piece by piece, waiting for something only she understood. Then, late one night, Elias called for her. The servants saw her ascend the staircase in her nightdress, carrying a single candle. They said she didn't return until dawn. No one knows what passed between them in those hours. But by morning, Elias looked changed, pale, withdrawn, almost obedient. He gave no orders that day. He barely spoke. And when Martha entered the room, he stood. Automatically. From that moment, their roles, master and slave, husband and wife, began to blur in ways that terrified everyone who saw it. Outside, the plantation continued its rhythm. The crack of the overseer's whip, the hum of work songs, the creak of wagon wheels. But inside the Harrington mansion, a quieter rhythm had taken hold, the measured footsteps of a woman who had once been property and now, somehow, held her master in the palm of her hand. To the world, she was still nameless, an M in the ledger books, a blank space on a marriage certificate. But to Elias Harrington, her name had become something he couldn't say without his throat tightening. Martha, a name that, before the year was out, would destroy him. By the winter of 1852, Raven's Cross Plantation no longer sounded like a place where life was lived. It sounded like a place being watched. The laughter of guests, once echoing through its high-ceilinged halls, had faded into the distant past. The great piano in the parlor sat untouched, collecting dust. And at the head of the long mahogany table now sat a woman no one dared to address without trembling. Martha Harrington, the same woman who, only months before, had scrubbed those very floors. Her rise was not loud or violent. It was quiet, calculated, like the slow spreading of ink across linen. At first, the staff believed this strange arrangement, a master marrying his slave, wouldn't last. They assumed Elias would tire of her or drink himself into forgetfulness. But instead, the opposite happened. Elias changed. The man who once barked orders now hesitated before speaking. The gambler who once filled nights with raucous laughter now dined in silence, stealing glances at the woman beside him like a schoolboy afraid of being caught. He had grown pale, restless, hollow-eyed. And Martha, once trembling and unsure, had become something else entirely. She didn't command. She didn't shout. She didn't even need to. Her authority came from stillness, a kind of calm that made others uneasy. Servants would later tell stories of how she moved through the house at dawn, barefoot, her white gown trailing softly over the wooden floors. She lit no candles, yet always seemed to see perfectly in the dark. She watched everything, one elderly housemaid recalled decades later. Watched like she was counting our breaths. Even the overseer, a man twice her size and brutal by nature, lowered his eyes when she passed. Something had shifted, not just in the hierarchy of Raven's Cross, but in the very air. The plantation had a new mistress, and though no one said it aloud, everyone understood. She ruled it through silence. By February 1853, Elias was a shadow of the man society once admired. He stopped riding into town. His letters to business partners grew incoherent, rambling. He'd scribble phrases like, "She knows everything," and "I can't think when she looks at me." Dr. William Fincher, the local physician, noted in his ledger that Elias was suffering from nervous exhaustion and persistent insomnia. In private notes later found among his belongings, the doctor wrote something far more chilling. The patient displays signs of fear rather than illness. He speaks as though being watched at all times, even in his sleep. Fincher prescribed rest. But what Elias needed wasn't rest. It was freedom, and that he no longer had. Meanwhile, Martha's transformation deepened. The servants said she began spending hours alone in her room, her door locked. Once, A housemaid peered through the keyhole and swore she saw Martha sitting before a small wooden box, a box that gleamed with brass fittings and seemed to whisper when opened. Inside, they later discovered, were items that would defy explanation: a contract written in what appeared to be blood, a small doll pierced with pins, and a faded letter addressed to my dearest daughter. That letter, now preserved in the University of South Carolina archives, would reveal something that changed the entire story. The writer called herself, "Your mother who loves you still, though we are parted." The handwriting matched records from an enslaved woman named Esther, a woman once owned by Elias's father. If true, that meant Martha was not only Elias's property but his half-sister. Was this marriage a cruel joke arranged by Thornton, or a long-planned act of vengeance by Martha herself? Historians would argue for years. But for those living inside Raven's Cross, one thing was certain: the house itself had turned against its master. Elias began locking doors that led nowhere. He claimed to hear footsteps in the empty hallways. One night, a servant found him staring into a mirror, whispering, "She's behind me, even when she's not." By spring, the man who once prided himself on control had none left. His every thought, every word, seemed shaped by her, as though she were molding him quietly, invisibly, from the inside out. And Martha, she no longer smiled.
She didn't need to.
Her presence alone commanded obedience. She never raised her voice, recalled Polly Mae Johnson, a young servant girl at the time. But when she looked at you, you felt smaller, like she could see every lie you ever told. By March, no one in Beaufort County dared mention the Harringtons in public. The invitations stopped arriving. The family name, once synonymous with wealth, became a whisper, followed by averted eyes. Inside the mansion, Elias Harrington, once master of all he surveyed, now flinched when his wife entered a room. And Martha, the woman once deemed unsuitable, had become the center of his world, not through love, but through something colder:
Control.
The house at Raven's Cross no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. By early spring of 1853, Raven's Cross had grown unnaturally still. The plantation's gates creaked less, the wind seemed quieter, and even the river that once shimmered beside the rice fields looked dull and motionless, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside the mansion, time had begun to warp. Days bled into nights, and nights into something darker. Elias Harrington, once the proud master of his estate, now slept little and ate less. He had taken to sitting for hours in his study, staring at the same set of papers, his hand occasionally twitching as though to sign something, then stopping midair. The servants whispered that Madame Martha had changed him, hollowed him out somehow. One claimed to have seen her slip something into his drink, another swore she'd caught Martha burning strange herbs in her room. But no one dared to question her. At Raven's Cross, curiosity had become dangerous. Then came the box. It appeared one afternoon in April, a small, polished chest with brass fittings, delivered from Savannah. The invoice, written in Elias's handwriting, described it simply as a personal commission. But when the carpenter who'd built it was later interviewed, he said something that sent chills through local historians decades later. The woman who placed the order never gave her name, only said it was for keeping what must not be seen. The chest was carried into Martha's room and never opened in public again. She kept it locked at all times, the key hanging from a chain around her neck. No one, not even Elias, was allowed near it. At night, when the house was silent, some said they heard her whispering softly to whatever lay inside. Others claimed faint scratching came from within, like something trapped, something alive. But whether the sound was real or imagined, the effect was the same: fear. Pure, bone-deep fear. The truth of what that box contained would remain a mystery for nearly half a century, until 1896, when a fire damaged the old house and forced a renovation. During the repairs, workers found the box sealed inside a wall cavity of what had been Martha's room. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, a historian present when it was opened, documented what he saw. Inside were 3 items: a contract, written not in ink, but in what he believed to be blood. A small cloth doll, pierced with pins in its torso, and a letter, yellowed and delicate, addressed to "My dearest daughter," dated 1831. That letter, as later confirmed, was written by an enslaved woman named Esther, Martha's mother. It ended with the words, "You are of me and of him. They will not remember, but you must. Justice is patient. Wait for it." If this was truly Martha's mother, and him referred to Elias's father, the implications were unbearable. Martha, the woman forced into marriage with Elias, might have been the daughter of the very man who'd enslaved her mother, which meant she was family. And perhaps that was the cruelest revenge of all, because through that marriage, Martha had made Elias suffer the sins of his own bloodline, a retribution that spanned generations. From that point onward, Elias's decline accelerated. His journals from May 1853 survive, though most are nearly unreadable, filled with scribbled lines and erratic handwriting. In one entry, he wrote, "The sound of her breathing follows me. Even when she sleeps, she knows. The walls listen when I move." And another, "There is something in her eyes I cannot endure. I dream of them even when awake. I no longer know if my thoughts are mine." Those words weren't the ramblings of a drunken man. They were confessions. Elias Harrington, the proud master of Raven's Cross, had lost control of his own mind. Meanwhile, Martha's composure never wavered. She dressed elegantly, spoke rarely, and began to keep detailed records of plantation finances, something women, much less enslaved women, were never permitted to do. But Elias signed every paper she placed before him. Always. Neighbors noticed. One Charleston merchant even remarked, "I don't know who's running Raven's Cross anymore, but it isn't Elias." And he was right, because by that summer, Elias was barely present. He wandered the halls like a man haunted by something he couldn't name, something that lived behind a locked door and a woman's steady, unblinking gaze. Years later, when scholars pieced the evidence together, the blood-written contract, the doll, the letter, they realized the box was more than a container. It was a symbol, a vault for secrets, vengeance, and power reclaimed. Whatever Martha kept inside wasn't meant to be found. It was meant to remind her, and perhaps them all, that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark, behind a locked lid. And when the time comes, it opens. By late spring of 1853, Elias Harrington was no longer a man. He was a reflection of one, fading a little more each day. His staff avoided him. His business associates stopped writing. And the proud plantation owner, who once controlled hundreds of acres, now trembled in his own home, afraid of the woman who shared his name. The plantation doctor, William Fincher, made 4 visits that season. In his public ledger, he described Elias as suffering from nervous exhaustion. But his private notes, later found tucked inside a medical journal after his death, painted a different picture. "Patient exhibits signs of paranoia," Fincher wrote. "Speaks of being watched, even through walls. Refuses to eat unless food prepared by wife. Complains of eyes upon him while he sleeps." When Fincher suggested rest, Elias snapped, "Rest? How can I rest when she never blinks?" By then, Martha's transformation was complete. Gone was the frightened housemaid who once stammered when spoken to. In her place stood a woman so composed, so unreadable, that even her silence carried weight. The servants said she barely spoke anymore, yet everyone obeyed her. She had become the gravity of the household, and everyone else simply orbited her. When Elias entered a room, he seemed smaller somehow, his posture bent, his words hesitant. Martha didn't need to command him. She simply looked at him, and he obeyed. She'd sit there, one surviving account recalled, just watching him, not saying a thing. Her face calm, but her eyes, those eyes, they did all the talking. At first, Elias tried to fight back. He began locking his study door at night. He burned letters, tore pages from his journal, and once even attempted to flee the plantation. But he didn't make it far. A carriage driver found him at dawn by the edge of the river, barefoot and dazed. When asked what he was doing, Elias replied in a whisper, "She's inside my thoughts. I can't leave her behind. She follows without moving." He returned home without protest. Martha was waiting on the veranda, calm as ever. She didn't scold him. She didn't speak at all. She simply reached out her hand, and he took it. As weeks passed, Elias's mind began to unravel in ways that terrified the staff. He'd start conversations with people who weren't there. He'd stop mid-sentence, tilting his head like he was listening to a voice only he could hear. One night, a housemaid heard him pacing and muttering through the study door. The next morning, she found pages strewn across his desk. The writing was frantic, looping over itself. "She watches me even when she is not in the room. The air carries her gaze. It waits in the corners." Another entry. "My thoughts feel borrowed. I think her words before I speak them. My will is not my own." Each line was dated closer to his death, each one more desperate than the last. Martha, meanwhile, appeared untouched by the chaos surrounding her. She dressed in dark silk now, clothes ordered from Charleston's finest tailor. She walked the halls at night with a small candle, stopping occasionally to look in mirrors. The servants swore the candle never flickered, no matter how cold the wind. They said she was measuring the house, room by room, corner by corner, as if taking possession not just of space, but of memory itself. And maybe she was, because by then, Raven's Cross was no longer Elias's house. It was hers. By June, Elias had become skeletal. He refused company, refused food, and spoke only when spoken to. The once proud man who used to fill rooms with his booming voice now flinched at his own reflection. Dr. Fincher returned one last time. In his private letter to a colleague in Philadelphia, he confessed something he never dared say aloud. "There are signs of poisoning, though not by known means. The pupils remain dilated even in deathly exhaustion. It may be the result of certain herbal toxins known to the enslaved population. I cannot prove it, but I suspect she is the cause." On July 7, 1853, Elias Harrington was found dead in his study. His head rested on his journal, the ink still wet from his final line. "She's still watching." The coroner listed the cause of death as apoplexy, a sudden stroke. But those who saw the body swore his eyes were open wide, his expression frozen not in pain, but in realization. As if, in that final moment, he'd seen the truth of what had been happening all along, and who had truly been in control. By the following morning, Martha had vanished. No carriage tracks, no witnesses, no farewell. She simply disappeared. Some said she'd run away. Others whispered she'd never left at all, that her spirit still lingered within those decaying walls, watching, waiting, remembering. Whatever the truth, the legend of Raven's Cross was born that day, the story of a man who watched his own destruction, and a woman who needed only her silence to bring it about. Because sometimes vengeance doesn't scream. It only stares and waits. The morning of July 7, 1853, broke with an eerie calm. The rain had stopped, the cicadas were silent, and over the rice fields, a low mist clung to the ground like breath held too long. Inside the mansion, not even the clocks seemed to tick. Elias Harrington was dead. He'd been found slumped over his desk, his quill still in hand, his final sentence scrawled across the page. "She's still watching." When the servants discovered him, they didn't scream. They just stared. They had all known something was coming. The air in that house had been heavy for weeks, like a storm that never broke. Dr. William Fincher arrived that afternoon. His report was clinical, detached, the kind of official summary that looks tidy on paper. Cause of death: apoplexy. No evidence of external violence. But his private correspondence told a darker story. In a letter to a colleague dated weeks later, he confessed. The pupils were wide as if frozen in terror. The stiffness of the limbs, the color of the lips, I have seen this before, though not from natural causes. Certain plant toxins can mimic such effects, but I have no proof, only suspicion, and I dare not voice it here. Fincher's suspicion was clear. Elias hadn't died by chance. Someone, perhaps someone within those walls, had helped him along. But if Elias was gone, where was Martha? That question would haunt Beaufort County for years. When officials began the formal inventory of the Harrington estate, Martha's name was missing from the records. No bill of sale, no manumission papers, no trace of a departure. It was as if she had evaporated. Some claimed she had fled under cover of night, slipping into the swamps where maroon communities of escaped enslaved people lived hidden among the cypress trees. Others whispered she'd buried something before she left, or someone. There were even stories that, the night before Elias's death, a faint light had been seen moving across the fields, a single candle floating steadily toward the chapel. Over the following months, Raven's Cross began to decay. Without its master, the estate faltered. Crops failed, overseers left, and the house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its silence. The new owners, relatives of the Harrington line, sold it off piece by piece until only the mansion remained, standing alone like a mausoleum to pride and punishment. Yet even as the plantation died, its story refused to. Those who stayed behind told tales, whispers that Martha's spirit still wandered the halls, that sometimes, in the dead of night, a woman's shadow could be seen pacing near the study windows. Always pacing, always watching. But not everyone believed in ghosts. Some believed in guilt, and that the haunting wasn't supernatural at all, but something psychological left behind by the things people refused to speak of. Nearly a century later, in 1939, a group of historians reopened the Harrington files. What they found only deepened the mystery. There, in the old archives, was Fincher's hidden letter, the one hinting at poison. Alongside it were fragments of Elias's final journal entries, his handwriting frantic and uneven. The whispers follow me. The food tastes strange, sweet, then bitter. She smiles without her eyes. Each line was dated within days of his death. And then came the strangest discovery of all, reports from the 1930s of an elderly woman living deep in the swamps near the Combahee River. She called herself Margaret, but the locals said she spoke with a Charleston accent and carried a man's gold pocket watch. She never mentioned her past, but once, when asked about her family, she replied, "They're all buried where justice found them." When she died, she left behind a silver hand mirror and a faded letter, the same letter Reverend Whitmore had written about decades earlier. The one signed, "Your mother, who loves you still." Could it be that Martha had survived, that she'd escaped, lived free, even prosperous, under another name? Or was that too convenient a truth for a story soaked in blood and vengeance? Historians never agreed. But one thing remained certain. The silence at Raven's Cross was not peace. It was punishment. When archaeologists finally excavated the plantation cemetery in 1959, they found something that reignited the legend entirely, an unmarked grave, only 6 feet from Elias Harrington's headstone. Inside were the remains of a woman in her late 20s. Buried with her were pieces of expensive jewelry and silk ribbons binding her wrists. The official report never named her, but those who saw the body had no doubt. It was her, one said softly. It was Martha. No one knows who buried her, or why she was buried beside the man she destroyed. Perhaps guilt brought her back. Perhaps vengeance had a final price. Or perhaps the silence she'd left behind finally claimed her, too. In the end, Raven's Cross became more than a plantation. It became a wound, one that refused to close. A place where the line between justice and damnation blurred beyond recognition. Because at Raven's Cross, silence didn't mean peace. It meant something unfinished. Something or someone still waiting to be heard. By the mid-20th century, Raven's Cross had long been abandoned, its mansion reduced to a hollow skeleton of brick and ash, its once grand verandas overtaken by moss and time. Locals called it the plantation that swallowed its own name. Hunters avoided it. Children dared each other to approach its crumbling gates, but few ever crossed them. For a while, it seemed history had finally buried the story of Elias and Martha Harrington. until 1959. That year, a team of archaeologists from the University of North Carolina arrived, hoping to conduct a simple survey of the plantation cemetery. Their goal was academic: catalog graves, confirm dates, maybe uncover artifacts for a study on antebellum burial practices. But what they found changed the entire narrative. The cemetery lay half-hidden behind a tangle of live oaks. Marble headstones leaned at crooked angles, their inscriptions softened by a century of rain. The Harrington family plot sat at the center. White stone, neat rows, the illusion of dignity. But just a few feet beyond Elias Harrington's marked grave, the ground looked uneven, disturbed. When the team began to dig, they didn't expect much. Maybe a misplaced foundation stone. Maybe an animal burrow. Instead, they found bones, the fragile remains of a woman, buried without a marker. She'd been buried close. Too close. Dr. James Merritt, the lead archaeologist, documented everything in meticulous detail: the angle of the skeleton's arms, the depth of the soil, the fragments of decayed silk still clinging to the wrists. And then there were the objects buried beside her, small but unmistakable. A pearl earring, a silver ring with a cracked gem, and a delicate hairpin carved in the same style as Charleston's elite women of the 1850s. Not the belongings of a servant, the belongings of a lady. But the strangest detail wasn't what she wore, it was how she was buried. Her hands were bound with what appeared to be silk ribbon, the fibers partially preserved by the clay. It was delicate, intentional, ceremonial. The team fell silent. Someone had buried her carefully, but not kindly. At first, they assumed she was a member of the Harrington family. But records showed no woman of that age missing or unaccounted for. The only person whose name didn't appear in any official document from the estate's final year was one Martha. And suddenly, the puzzle fit too perfectly to ignore. Could this be her? The enslaved woman turned mistress, turned myth? If so, how had she ended up in the family plot? And who had tied her wrists? Dr. Merritt wrote in his field notes that evening, "The burial site is wrong. Deliberate. Whoever buried her knew exactly what they were doing. There is intent here, and unease. The air feels heavy. It's as though the ground itself doesn't want to give her up." That was the last clear entry in his journal. 2 days later, the excavation abruptly stopped. Merritt reportedly suffered a psychological break. He left the site without explanation, resigned his position at the university, and moved west. When colleagues later examined his abandoned notes, they found a final, unfinished line scrawled at the bottom of the last page. "Something is wrong with this place. I dreamed of her again last night. She was standing at the foot of my bed, watching." The dig was never completed. The remaining team members sealed the site, covered the grave again, and filed a brief, sanitized report for the historical archives. Officially, the discovery was labeled "Unverified Remains of a 19th Century Woman." Unofficially, no one ever returned. But the locals noticed things. After the excavation, strange lights were seen moving among the ruins at night, small flickers, like candle flames wandering through fog. Farmers reported hearing footsteps near the edge of the woods, soft but rhythmic, like pacing. Always pacing. In 1961, Reverend Whitmore's grandson donated his grandfather's journals to the Charleston Historical Society. Among them was an interview from 1910 with a woman named Pearlie Mae Johnson, a child servant at Ravens Cross during the final year of Elias Harrington's life. Her account, written decades before the excavation, eerily echoed what the archaeologists had found. She described seeing Martha in those last months collecting herbs at night, whispering to herself, and once, standing by the riverbank, as if talking to the water. Johnson said, "She was different after that.
Calm.
Too calm. Like she knew what was coming." That same calm seemed to have followed her into the grave. Whether the body belonged to Martha or not, no one could prove. But the symbolism was too haunting to ignore. The woman who had risen from enslavement to mistress, buried silently beside the man who had enslaved and married her. Their bones lying side by side beneath the same soil, their story still unresolved. Even death hadn't separated them. After the excavation, the land around Raven's Cross was sold, resold, and eventually abandoned again. No development ever lasted. Locals claimed the ground refused it, machines broke down, workers fell ill, and some simply walked off, saying they felt watched. Whether it was guilt, myth, or something less human, no one knew. But every November, near the anniversary of that strange wedding in 1852, people still report the same thing near the ruins, faint candlelight weaving through the trees. No voices, no screams, just light, moving slowly,
Patiently.
as if someone or something is still there, waiting to be seen. By the late 20th century, Raven's Cross had crossed from history into legend, that murky space where fact and folklore blur until you can't tell one from the other. To most locals, it was just a ghost story about a cursed plantation. But to historians, psychologists, and cultural scholars, it was something far more disturbing, an unresolved case of power, vengeance, and human manipulation. The first person to seriously reopen the case was Professor Amelia Richardson of Georgetown University. In 2002, at a historic preservation conference in Charleston, she unveiled what she called the missing pages of Martha Harrington. Her research unearthed documents never before made public, a series of letters between Isaac Thornton, the Philadelphia banker, and his sister in Boston. They were dated between 1845 and 1852, the exact years leading up to Elias and Martha's infamous marriage. One letter, written just weeks before the wedding, changed everything. "The woman insists the time has come for her return," Thornton wrote. "She speaks with such conviction that I find myself believing her purpose, though she reveals little of it. I have agreed to her request, if only to see how this curious matter resolves itself. Her intellect is formidable." Thornton was referring, unmistakably, to Martha, the woman he'd once purchased, the woman who'd vanished from his household 7 years earlier, had come back, not by chance, but by design. Richardson's findings suggested that Martha had orchestrated her own return to Raven's Cross, convincing Thornton to use her as part of his arrangement with Elias Harrington. What looked like punishment may have been something else entirely, a plan Martha had nurtured for years.
But why?
For that answer, Richardson turned to an old plantation ledger from 1840. It listed a child named Martha, described as mulatto, age 4, daughter of kitchen woman Esther. A note beside it read, "Property of Harrington." A decade later, both Esther and her daughter disappeared from the record. Parish death logs from St. Michael's Church in Charleston told part of the story. May 1844, burial of Esther, enslaved woman, property of Harrington Plantation. Cause of death, fall from height. But oral histories collected by Richardson from descendants of formerly enslaved families told a darker version. Esther hadn't fallen. She'd been pushed, after threatening to reveal a secret that could have ruined the Harrington family. The secret, they said, was that Martha was Elias's half-sister. And that's when everything began to make sense. If Martha had grown up knowing her mother was killed for speaking the truth, then her return to Raven's Cross wasn't coincidence. It was justice, sharpened by patience. Dr. Lawrence Petton, a historian of slavery psychology, called it a methodical campaign of retribution executed through psychological colonization. In simpler terms, Martha had done what few enslaved people ever could. She'd flipped the system from within. She'd used the very tools of control, obedience, silence, invisibility, to dismantle her oppressor's mind. But this wasn't rebellion. It wasn't escape. It was something colder, smarter, and infinitely more disturbing. Petton wrote, "Martha's power lay not in overt defiance, but in quiet subversion. She didn't fight the master. She hollowed him out. She made him doubt his own autonomy until his will no longer belonged to him." He called her vengeance the most terrifying form of resistance, one that erases the line between justice and cruelty. Then came an even stranger twist. In 1962, long before Richardson's work, a small leather-bound journal had been discovered during the renovation of a house in St. Augustine, Florida. The author's initials were MH, and the entries began in August 1853, just a month after Elias Harrington's death. The handwriting matched samples from the fragments of Martha's journal found decades earlier at the Charleston Museum. In one entry, dated December 21st, 1853, the writer confessed, "I dreamed of the plantation." He still writes the words I dictate. His hand moves, but the thoughts are mine. The circle is closed. The debt is paid. Another, dated March 1854, read, "I sleep without dreams now. They would call it vengeance. I call it balance restored." If this was truly Martha's writing, it meant she hadn't died in South Carolina at all. She'd fled, perhaps under a new name. A woman named Margaret Hamilton, a free woman of color, appeared in property records for St. Augustine that same year. She owned a modest home and left her estate to a school for freed children after her death in 1872. No photos, no confirmed origin, only whispers that she'd come from somewhere north of Savannah and spoke like a woman who'd known power once. It was never proven, but the implication was chilling. Martha didn't just survive. She won. Richardson ended her lecture with a line that silenced the entire hall. History remembers the horrors of slavery as one-sided, the oppressor and the oppressed. But Raven's Cross reminds us that sometimes, within silence, an enslaved woman found a way to reclaim power. Not loudly, not with fire or rebellion, but with patience, the most dangerous weapon of all. Her words lingered, just as Martha's story had for over a century, because the truth at Raven's Cross wasn't just about what happened. It was about what patience can do when it's sharpened into purpose, and about how vengeance, once awakened, can outlive even the people who carried it. Time has a way of softening even the darkest stories, but not this one. More than a century and a half after the wedding at Raven's Cross, the land where it all happened still refuses to sleep. The mansion is gone now, burned down in 1942 under suspicious circumstances. Only its foundations remain, half swallowed by the forest. The columns lie cracked in the dirt like fallen sentinels, and vines curl around what was once the grand staircase. But if you stand there at dusk, when the air turns thick and the marsh fog begins to rise, the silence feels alive. People say it listens. In 1984, an archaeological team returned to the site during an environmental impact study. They weren't looking for ghosts. They were looking for evidence, and what they found was far more unsettling. Beneath what had once been Martha's room, they uncovered a small underground chamber. It was only 6 feet wide, 5 feet tall, but the air inside was stale and heavy, as if sealed for more than a century. On the walls, someone had written, hundreds of lines, carved into the plaster with deliberate precision. Most had faded with time, but a few remained legible. Phrases like, "Fears silence more than noise," "Fears watching more than confrontation." Use this. They weren't random. They were observations, psychological notes. Dr. Ellen Jenkins, who led the dig, described it best. It was as if someone had studied another person's mind, recorded their weaknesses, and turned them into a plan. The markings formed a timeline spanning years. This wasn't impulse or coincidence. It was strategy, patient, surgical, terrifyingly intelligent. It was Martha's handwriting. Jenkins's report concluded that the chamber had likely been used during Martha's early years on the plantation, a hidden space where she recorded what she observed of her captors. She wasn't simply surviving. She was preparing. The discovery reframed everything scholars thought they knew. This wasn't a story about a sudden reversal of power. It was a long, deliberate act of psychological engineering. Raven's Cross wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by intention. And yet, even with all the evidence, the unease wouldn't leave. The excavation team described strange sensations, headaches, nausea, the feeling of being watched from behind. One worker refused to return after claiming he heard soft footsteps in the chamber when no one else was there. Eventually, the land developers pulled their funding. The site was donated to a conservation trust under one condition, that nothing ever be built there again. Since then, The forest has reclaimed it. The old pathways have vanished beneath moss, but locals still warn outsiders not to linger after dark. Some say the temperature drops near the ruins, that the air grows heavier, like someone standing close. Too close. Not threatening.
Just observing.
In 2010, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee revisited the unmarked grave discovered decades earlier. Using modern techniques, she determined that the bones weren't from 1853 at all, but from the 1870s, decades after Elias's death. That meant the woman buried beside him wasn't Martha. Who she was remains unknown. But that revelation only deepened the mystery. If Martha wasn't buried there, where had she gone? Some historians insist she lived the rest of her life as Margaret Hamilton, the quiet philanthropist of St. Augustine. Others believe she died long before then, her body lost but her story lingering like smoke in the trees. Either way, her presence, her watching, remains woven into the history of the place. The most chilling interpretation came from Dr. Valerie Henderson, whose 2018 analysis of Raven's Cross reframed it as a case of psychological colonization. She wrote, Martha identified the flaw in the system that enslaved her, that even those who claim ownership of others are vulnerable to influence, manipulation, and fear. She weaponized invisibility. She used patience as power. Her conclusion was simple and unforgettable. The true terror of Raven's Cross isn't what was done to Martha. It's what Martha chose to do in return. Today, the land where Raven's Cross once stood is protected by law. No homes, no roads, no memorials. Just trees, marsh, and the echo of something unresolved. Visitors who find their way there, usually locals or history enthusiasts, describe the same unnerving sensation. A weight in the air, a faint hum of presence, and the feeling that someone or something is measuring them in silence. One old guide said it best. It ain't ghosts out there. It's memory. Cold, patient memory. The kind that watches, not to haunt, but to remind. And maybe that's the true legacy of Raven's Cross. Not a love story. Not even a ghost story. But a warning about pride, cruelty, and what happens when power forgets that those beneath it can see, learn, and wait. Martha didn't just survive her world. She rewrote it, quietly, and her silence still speaks. Because even now, if you stand in the ruins of Raven's Cross and listen closely, you might hear footsteps. Not running, not chasing, just walking back and forth. Patient, deliberate. As though justice itself is still pacing, still watching, still not finished.